We're here to share with you inspiring stories that bring to life all the little and big ways that people bring more love, joy, laughter, and humanness to everyday life. Our focus is the hunt for those little moments that refuel the human soul and reminds us what life is really all about. I invite you to sit back, enjoy the moments, enjoy the stories, the adventures, and the journeys. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of What the World Needs More of. I am here with my good friend Ben. Sir, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Jared.
All right. Now, the question of the show, we'll dive right in. What do you feel the world needs more of?
There's a few thoughts that I have. I think, especially given the political climate in the United States and what you're seeing around the world, we need more truth and a basis of determining what is true. There's a lot of misinformation which is deliberately put out there by politicians and others in media. And I feel that in the last 5 years, there's just been an extreme amount of confusion about what is actually a fact. So some way of finding, of being able, if you're searching for information on the internet, of being able to actually determine like, oh, this is actually something that's true, it's from a centralized source. And I think part of the problem that we've been seeing is this lack of trust in institutions and this undermining of what is actually true. I'm not necessarily presenting a solution for that, but I think even in people's everyday interactions, taking time to be thoughtful about what they know to be true, what source of information, if they're quoting something, and also if you read something on the internet, take a moment to take a look and see, like, where did that information come from? Were there any key assumptions, in there, or is it just hearsay? And I think that because information is so abundant today, and there's so much of it, you just get lazy, and I'm guilty of it too. And you just read, and you don't necessarily take the time to actually think about where it's coming from, and if there's somebody who's potentially has an incentive to give you misinformation. The other thing, too, I think the world needs more of is, to use Stephen Covey's quote, an abundance mentality. I really love the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. First read it, I think, about 15 years ago. And he talked about an abundance mentality and a scarcity mentality. And I really believe in life, where you look is where you go. So if you want to believe that you're living in a world where there's an abundance of material goods, of love, of empathy, versus a scarcity, what you see and feel is ultimately what you're going to manifest. So I think a lot of what we're seeing today, too, as we talk about the widening gap between the rich and the poor, is driven partially by a scarcity mentality that many people hold. The recent tax cuts that were passed in the United States, I think, are reflective of the scarcity mentality. I don't necessarily think those tax cuts will do any long-term good for the economy. In fact, if anything, they're probably going to cut economic demand and just boost corporate profits in the short run. And I think that the more that people can take a mentality that there is an abundance mentality and a degree of optimism that you have to take on faith, it helps alleviate some of the problems that you see today. The world needs more empathy, the ability to recognize our common humanity. Not doing so, I think, also leads to a scarcity mentality. And gratitude, I think, is the last point I would say. I think that people should try to take time and feel gratitude I try to do it, and when I don't do it, after a while, when I haven't done it, I realize like, oh, I haven't been, I haven't taken time to be grateful for my life and what I have and who I have in my life. My view is the more gratitude you feel, the more you're going to attract opportunities, the more you're going to attract people. People like being around people who are grateful. People don't like being around people who are ungrateful. It's pretty simple. It's magnetism. Either it'll attract or repel. And when I think of all these things about the need for truth, the need for an abundance mentality, for empathy, for the ability to feel gratitude, I think a lot of the problems we're seeing today stem from a lack of these things. So we are going through this crisis of institutions, and you're seeing this with, I think, with the Trump presidency here in the United States, Brexit, the United Kingdom, the rise of authoritarianism around the world. And I think that the best way to combat this sort of crisis we're going through is with these things.
I love it. I love it. And speaking of it's your, I love your opinion on this, and I agree with it. And I'd love to know how it came about. And in doing that, I'd love to know, what do you feel is your wow factor? What makes you uniquely you? And what are some historical moments that help shape that over the years? Maybe to give us context of how it shaped into these thoughts.
Yeah, I actually thought about this. I don't think I have a wow factor, Jarek, to be completely honest and humble. I just think that these things that I've thought about have just been through my observations over the course of my 41 years on the planet, and I'm very, very lucky and grateful to have had a really good education, which exposed me to studying philosophy. And one of my majors in college was in philosophy, and I think that helped me think a little bit more deeply about these kind of issues and what motivates people. Incentives. I spent a lot of time thinking about incentives, especially for a couple of the companies I've formed, and what motivates people beyond just financial incentives. And so I've tried to study what happens within people internally and what happens in people in societies, and so I think that's what's helped shape these views, and the ability to be able to to read and find the time to read gets that. And I think also having gone through forming my own company, working in large companies. I worked for, I've seen companies rise and fall. I worked, my first company that I worked for was a business called Enron in Texas. I was there for 2 years, fresh out of school. I was fired with the bankruptcy when that all happened in 2001. I've worked for a very large investment bank and for many, many years, and worked all over the world as part of that business in the commodities trading business. And I've also done my own thing where I've raised my own, I've run my own business, and I've raised money for that. I've got investor capital. I've lost investor capital. I've gotten investor capital, lost investor capital. Had some businesses fail, some businesses I've sold. And I think that having worked with a lot of different people around the world who come from different backgrounds, I think these are common themes that I've just noticed, right? It doesn't matter where you're from, and but I think these are just truths that are applicable to everyone because of our shared common humanity. We want truth, we want empathy, we want to feel abundance, and when we feel like we're not getting those things, it pushes us towards fear and scarcity.
So many things brought you there: observation, learning about philosophy and diving deep, thinking deeply, human incentives, what drives people, reading and learning, going through the journey of working for or within an organization, large and small, starting your own and going through that journey of how to present it and bring it to the world. And like you said, though, the context of living and working around the globe in different countries and regions and moments of life, it starts to show you like, hey, these are commonalities that exist. That's powerful. It's really powerful. I mean, I heard it said that only 13% of the U.S., and I'll have to double check this fact to make sure it's true, but 13% of the U.S. has a passport and even less use it, which makes me scratch my head because there's so much an opportunity to travel. And if that's coming from this country, I wonder what the stats of the rest of the world are like. And hopefully, I think Europeans travel more. It seems like it, at least, because they're close and they go from place to place. Australians seem to have a knack for always wanting to move around and have their gap year where they go out and explore. But it's interesting to see how many people are engaged in that immersion process and learning process to really get into the world and see what's out there, even just the town next door. Doesn't have to be another country, but seeing how that evolves. I think that's really powerful, and it's great insight for other people who are looking for those types of experiences.
Yeah, and I would just say some of my experiences have anecdotally backed up what you're saying. I lived in London, in the United Kingdom, for 6 years, and I've spent quite a lot of time in Europe for the last 35 years. My grandparents retired in France, so I would go to France in the summers, while I was living in New York City growing up, which was pretty unusual, and it was, again, something I'm very grateful for. One thing I've noticed, just as my observation, having lived in the United Kingdom and come back to the United States and living in a very international city like New York, I still feel that people who live in New York are more insular than people who live in Europe, especially people who live in London. And when you're living abroad in Europe, you're around so many other countries with long histories and cultures that have been around for much longer than the United States, and people that speak different languages. New York really is, it's part of America, and New York's quite different from the rest of America. And people in New York tend to travel more than people in America. And I've also had the ability to run a business, in the United States, where a lot of people who were working for us didn't live in New York, and I think quite a number of those people didn't travel. Some of them didn't have passports, or didn't travel outside the United States, or maybe they'd gone to Mexico. And it's not necessarily a good or bad thing. I'm not trying to pass judgment either way. But just from my personal observation, yes, I would agree with that. I think Americans tend to travel less than people in Europe. And part of that is, I think a large part of that is geography. But that does inform your views. Your news feed is probably more dominated by U.S.-centric news, less about what's going on in the rest of the world. I think Americans should sometimes take a step back if they don't and realize, as a percentage of the total population, we're probably about 5% of the total world population, even though we have the world's largest economy, and the universe doesn't revolve around us. And power dynamics are shifting over time, right? China will eclipse the United States as the world's largest economy at some point. And America's influence is waning in the world. And I think some of the influence that we're losing is being accelerated by our current president. And that's unfortunate, because that is going away. And so I think the reality is that over the next 20 or 30 years, the power dynamic is going to shift, where America has less power, less influence. And I think that it would suit Americans to be aware of that and to think very carefully about their decisions and how they can be, useful in the changing economy.
I love that. And of all of your travels and living in different places and working in different places, what would you say? I'd love to know, what would you say is a humbling moment, a moment that left you feeling humble in that time?
Probably the most humbling moment I've had recently was my mother's passing, which was about 6 months ago in February. And that was pretty upsetting, even though she'd been sick for some time with cancer. it was pretty upsetting just because in some ways I didn't really expect it to happen. And when it was happening, it happened so quickly. It was very emotional, but there were some extremely positive things that came out of it. And one of those things was just intense gratitude and an intense sense of humility, right? Intense sense of humility about things that made me step back, and I dropped everything and made me think about things that I was taking for granted, things that I thought were important, but really were not that important, things that really made me angry and upset about things related to a business I was running that I thought were important, and I realized they weren't. And it also made me feel humble because of what my mom had done for me over the course of my life, the things that I never said thank you for, and how much of who I am today, given the sacrifices that she and my dad had to make for me. And again, just this feeling of gratitude. So, it was a horrible experience for my mother, but she died with a tremendous amount of dignity and never complained, and ended up making me feel, in some ways, like, wow, like I've been a bit of a shithead. Haven't been grateful for the right things, and it made me feel extremely humble.
Wow. Here's a question. What about an awe-inspiring moment?
I imagine other people have said this to you. Admittedly, I haven't listened to your other podcast, so I'm sorry. I will. But it was really the birth of my daughter. And I have 3 children now. But by the way, not just my daughter, but all 3 children. I cried at all 3 of them, and I told myself I wasn't going to. And after she was born, I was like, I'm definitely not crying next time I have a kid, and I did. And it's just awesome. And even though I've seen it happen before, and my most recent child was born 3 weeks ago, it's just an incredible experience. It's just amazing. It's amazing. It's a miracle of life, and it's just such a cool thing.
That's awesome. Only one other person has said that, and,
okay.
and believe it or not, and so in sharing that, his experience was, it was incredible and awe-inspiring to see what the human body was truly capable of. He has a lot of respect for his wife and partner, but to observe the possibilities of what it can handle and how it can endure and create and go through that process, just blew his mind. He didn't know what he didn't know until it happened, and his mind was forever shifted in an awe-inspiring way of just thinking, wow, what a capacity the human body has, specifically the female body in that case.
It's amazing. Yeah, I agree. And it's like a lot of things in life, right? You can be told something, but a lot of things you'll never learn until you actually live it. That's and I think there was a good friend of mine who wrote a book called Live It, by the way.
Hey, it's a good
thought. So I think that's true. It's like they say, you can be taught the teachings of the Buddha, but you're not going to experience enlightenment by just listening to the teachings. You have to actually go through it and experience it and understand it in a uniquely human way.
I love that. Moving forward, what's your greatest fear?
Mm-hmm. Not being good enough, not having something of value to contribute to the world.
Wow. I've never thought of that, but that hits home. The second part, the wanting to add value in some way, but unable if there's a place to be able to do so.
Yeah, I think it goes down to meaning, right? What's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of being here? And I've, racked my brain over this for the short time I've been on this planet, and I keep coming back to the fact that, by definition, purpose means that you're here to do something. It means you're here to have some sort of impact to leave the world in a better place than when you found it. And I have a fear of being some old dude that has absolutely no service and use to society. Perhaps it's irrational, but I just don't want to be that guy. And I can only imagine how terrifying it must feel to, be old in your life and frail and have, disability like schizophrenia and be losing your mind, and feeling like you have to have people constantly take care of you. And not that that's not a learning moment in itself, but when I think through, we must have some sort of purpose, right? That must be why we're here. Otherwise it's sort of just meaningless. I don't think that it's random that we exist. I don't think that consciousness is just a byproduct of evolution, and it actually means something to me, and I can feel it, and I just have, it's just this awareness, right? And I just feel that I don't want to take that for granted.
I like that. I like that. I think, like you said, there are beautiful lessons, and sometimes I don't think it's something that people worry about just about getting older. I've heard it many times from people in their 20s and teens saying, they're stressing out and they're frustrated because they can't find their purpose. They haven't defined what their purpose is yet, and they feel like they're getting older.
Yep.
And it's a need, it's a drive that people are hunting for at this stage of life.
Yep.
Around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of my earlier existential crises that I had was in college, where you basically had to decide upon your major, and this was in sophomore year. And typical liberal arts college in the United States, they give you lots of time to pad you with kick gloves and make sure you can think about it. Whereas if you were locked into an engineering program in the United Kingdom, you probably would have had to figure that out when you were 15 or something. But the reality of the situation is you don't have to figure it out then, and you can keep reinventing yourself as you get older, right? It's the thing that I've learned. But I remember at the time, I was really obsessed with this question of, what is it that I need to be doing? Why is it that I need to be doing this? And I really wanted to know the answer. And the thing that I realized, and it was a couple of years later, and it was really, the point was, you're not supposed to know. And in fact, you can't know. You have to live your life so that while you're living your life, these things start to become revealed to you through your experience, to go back to what we were talking about earlier. And that is why I really love this quote from the Austrian poet Rainer Maria Rilke. And he essentially said something along the lines of, and I'm going to do a very bad job quoting him, so I'll just paraphrase because I should know it offhand, but essentially it was letters to a young poet, and he was responding to somebody who was having the same sort of existential angst, where he was asking the questions about, what are we supposed to be doing in life? He was stressed out about not knowing what the answer was, and his answer was essentially like, listen, take it easy. You're not supposed to know. And the point of life now is to live the question. Live the question that you are asking, and someday you will live into the answers to those questions. And that really struck with me, and I thought that, I'm like, wow, that's really beautiful, that's really poetic, and that makes sense to me, right? And they gave me a sense of comfort in optimism. And the funny corollary to all of that was my mom actually knew about that quote. She knew that I really liked that quote. And my mom was a tenured professor at Long Island University, associate researcher at Columbia University, very smart woman, spoke Vietnamese and French fluently. She was a Vietnam scholar, wrote numerous books on the country, Southeast Asia, and truly was an academic. And even up to the last year where she was really sick, she'd still send me articles or things that she thought were important to me. And so that was my mom's way of basically being very thoughtful, and as she was always thinking about things that would be important to me intellectually. And I wasn't even planning on telling this story, but just before the funeral, before my mom passed, because she actually called an audible, and it was a Monday, And she was like, all right, this is my week. I'm going this week. And that's when it really hit home. And so she passed away. She said that on a Monday. She passed away on Thursday, early Thursday morning. And she told me, I remember I asked her then that week, because then it was really real. It was really happening. And I said to her, I'm like, all right, well, let's just say you pass over. And she wouldn't say whether or not she believed in the afterlife. She was just very coy about it. And I said, listen, let's just say hypothetically you pass over, you find out you're still there. How am I going to know that it's you, right? Are you going to send me some sort of sign? And my mom, I was like, listen, can you give me like a flower? And she's like, all right, well, it'll be a white camellia. I was like, I'm like, that's a terrible one because nobody knows what a white camellia is. I'm like, what about an animal? And she's like, all right, an alpaca. I was like, oh gosh. I'm like, that's terrible too. I was like, those are such obscure signs. And but my mom was also very stubborn. She always wanted to do things the way she wanted to do things. So fast forward a few days later, and we're at the funeral service, and I arranged for a minister to say some words, and he was non-denominational. He asked me what I wanted him to say, and I basically said, listen, I talked about her background, I talked about her career, I talked about things that are important to her, and I said, say whatever you want to say. You can quote whatever scripture you think is applicable for the moment, for the wake when he was giving a little speech about her, and but in no ways do I want to influence you in terms of what you should be picking. And that's all. I didn't tell him a single thing to look at. I said, you can do anything you want. I didn't guide his hand in any way or talk about anything my mom and I used to discuss, because I just wanted to see what he would do. So when he was giving the speech in at our wake, he basically quoted from the Bible. He quoted from a Buddhist text, and then he ended his speech, or eulogy rather, with a quote from an obscure Austrian poet named Rainer Maria Rilke. And he literally quoted the quote that I told you just earlier. And he said, I think that really sums up, how she lived her life. And I asked him later, I'm like, why did you pick that? He's like, I don't know. It sort of just came to me last night. And I mean, of all the canon of Western literature and poetry, he picks this dude and that quote, which my mom knew was one of my favorite quotes. It's not my favorite quote, which I never discussed with the guy. And by the way, if my mom were to have told me, like, hey, I'm around, and let me know that, that she wanted me to know it was her, that's the way she would have done it. She would have picked something like that was so obscure and meaningful, and then just to say, hey, I'm here. So I guess, I was thinking about, amazing and humbling things as well. That was incredibly humbling, when that minister read that quote.
That's powerful. It's very powerful. I think it's also something that ties together, we were talking about purpose and meaning and humbling moments and how all these things interslice into just daily life, and they're all there. A lot of time it comes back to what you said a lot earlier, which is one of your non-wow factors, but I think it's a wow factor, is observation. Seeing these things, noticing them because they're there. And what you said in the very beginning, what you look for, you find more of and amplify in your world, and the ability to train your mind to look for the amazing things. And you can call them miracles or blessings or signs or whatever, but to spot those as they're happening because they're everywhere. And when you can connect with them, all of a sudden it adds more substance to every moment. Because it can be meaningless and it's just stuff that random happens and randomness of existence, or it can piece together and actually mean something and link together and show you different things that are showing up in the world around you. I think it's very insightful, and I think it's very observant of you to see those things and notice them and appreciate them for what they are. It's very cool. Speaking of being excited, what are you most excited about for the future?
Seeing my kids grow up, and don't want them to grow up too quickly. I mean, one piece of advice I got constantly was, it happens too quick. Enjoy all your moment with all the time you have with your kids. Don't take it for granted. It happens so quickly. I mean, I heard this ad nauseum from people I didn't even know. I mean, I can't even tell you how many people have told me this, and my reaction the last couple of years have been, yeah, yeah, yeah. But recently, after I've just had my third kid, I was looking at my daughter the other day, and she's 4.5 years old, and I'm like, where did this little girl come from? And she's, gotten big, and I'm just thinking like, wow, like there's so much of a blur that's happened, especially when I'm looking at our new baby and how little he is and all the things he's going through. And I'd actually forgotten that my daughter had gone through some of these things. I'd forgotten that she was that way. And so I'm excited to be more mindful and about my kids and about my time. I think I took a lot of things for granted the last couple of years as I was building a business. And excited to just be more joyful about that time that I have with my family. And it's just so important. And I can't tell you, again, I can't overemphasize how many people who've been through it with kids keep saying this. I mean, I was on the beach last summer in Amagansett out in the Hamptons, and it was like something out of a movie. Like this older man walks by, and he sees two of my kids, the two kids I had at the time, playing on the beach, and he just starts talking to me. He's like, yeah, he's like, I have 3 kids, and we did this. We didn't have a lot of money, but if I could go back and do it all over again, like I would have had another 3. Like you'll always find more money, right? But you won't find more time. And he's like, you'll always make it work. And like that, he turned around, walked away, and he vanished in the mirage on the beach. Just disappeared. Now, I'm joking about that part, but he did walk away. And I just thought it was so funny. But so I'm excited to be mindful. I'm also excited about consciousness. Something we talked about earlier. I think we're going through a pretty shitty time in terms of global consciousness, particularly in a lot of developed countries. I think there's a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of polarization, and unfortunately, I think you just kind of have to go through this shit that we're going through. And I'm optimistic, cautiously optimistic, that if we can figure out a way to come to consensus on truth, on abundance, on empathy, on gratitude, then you can see consciousness start to change. And I'm generally an optimist. I do agree generally that the world has become a more peaceful place over the last 1,000 years. And I think some of the drivers for that have been just communication. There's been an increase in communication around the world, and with the internet, with the fact that I can text my buddy who was in France yesterday with his family, and we were texting. I remember when I would go to France in the summers, and it was very, very difficult to even get a phone call through. Just so the speed of communication has been pretty amazing. The downside is that can cut both ways too, right? And I think that a lot of the fear that you see today has been amplified by people being aware of things that they weren't aware of before. And it's much easier for negative news to get out, like it is for positive things, right? So other drivers for this increase in consciousness, the just general increase in transparency. I think that things are becoming more transparent, especially in financial markets. You look at the asset management space, there's been a huge drive for transparency in fees. And generally speaking, the more that you can make price signals transparent, it's just better for markets. It's better for investment long term, for actually capital being deployed into things. And one of the limits for growth is capital not being deployed into new ventures. And one of the limits for capital not wanting to go into new ventures is because there's not enough clarity about the underlying numbers. So hopefully over time, as there's more transparency about costs and figures and metrics, especially with the rise of big data, it will encourage more capital to flow into more businesses, which will encourage more job growth. And then in terms of consciousness, I would say also the rise of the woman. I think that the continual march of women basically being able to have more of a say and be allowed to have their rights respected. I still think there's quite a long way to go. We need more women in power, right? And I think you're already starting to see this with a lot of candidates that are coming up for the midterm elections. There's a lot more women here in the United States who are running for office, which I think is a great thing. I really wish more than 50% of our elected officials were women. I think we'd probably have less problems, quite honestly. And you can also see it with the Me Too movement in Hollywood. I think that has been a long overdue thing. And, I think that the more that we respect our women around the world, the safer and better the world will become. And then I would say the other things I'm excited about for the future, technology. Obviously, I'm sure a lot of people talk about that. The scale of technological changes and one change feeding off another change that wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago. It's absolutely amazing. It's dizzying. It obviously can cut both ways as well, where we don't understand the implications of things we're creating, such as what role Facebook had with previous elections. And but I'm incredibly optimistic, and I think that there's a lot of hope if we can basically continue to innovate and use technology for positive means. We have the ability to kill ourselves, obviously, and through nukes or killer robots or just sowing misinformation. But I think we also have the ability to do truly amazing things, such as colonize Mars, right? And I think in my lifetime, fingers crossed, I will see the first people on Mars, which would be amazing. And then finally, the other things I would say I'm excited about, just new opportunities to create new businesses, create wealth. There's just, with the rise of technology and changes in technology and communication tools, there's new ways to connect people, new ways to do business, and I think a lot of that's changing. So some of the things I'm looking at with my businesses involve that. And I think that there's a lot of potential wealth creation, and definitely excited about the future there.
I love all those things. And it's powerful. I think all these little shifts over history will transform so much and in so many ways, and create things that we don't even know. It'll lead to new things beyond our current limitation of understanding. That's wild. I love it. I'm looking forward to those things too. So we're going to switch gears, jump into what we call the nuts and bolts of the conversation. This is more tactical, practical, sure, applicable kind of thoughts and ideas for people. And much of what you shared, people can apply and, learn and experience in their own life even more. But in this side, we're going to look for just things they can do. And so the first question is, where do you spend and focus the majority of your thoughts and time in life each day as of right now?
Well, my usual schedule has been in complete flux because we just had a kid. And so a large part of that focus has been on the family recently and taking some time off work. And I would say, as we're starting to transition now back to quote unquote normal, although there really is no normal in our family, a lot of the time is spent with family every single day. There's just a constant need with the kids. There's a lot of my time as I start to shift back to quote unquote normal, reading. So basically making sure I'm on top of markets, reading things that I think are important for what I'm doing in business, things that deal with these other topics we've talked about, consciousness and technology. I think it's critical that you're taking in new information and constantly thinking about things. So I try to spend time reading, thinking, for my business, working with clients and businesses to solve problems, which is what gets me excited. And then hopefully, I haven't been very good about it recently, spending more time with me personally, on myself when I can, but making sure that I sort of hive off time every single day to really get centered in the morning. I think it's critical to have rituals, as you and I have discussed ad nauseum with each other. But the ability to be consistent every single day, and to be really thoughtful in the morning about your intention, your gratitude, what you want to accomplish, and creating the bookends of the day where you think about in the evening, okay, well, what happened? What did I do that was good? What could I have done that was better? I think it's important to have that kind of process. And so, and then it sort of brings you back, right, to where you are. So it's somewhat mundane, but I think it's pretty important.
It's powerful. Family, fatherhood, reading, thinking, being centered, all powerful things. In all of these elements, what do you say is one of the keys to your success?
There's a few things. I would say that it's really important to be able to see where you want to go. And it's really important once you've been able to see it, to be able to feel it. I have found that things that I am more likely to achieve in, that I want to set as a goal, I can actually feel it and I can believe in it. And when I'm seeing it emotionally. And I think a lot of it's also faith. When you talk about faith religiously, people talk about the importance of faith, which is you're just believing in something without knowledge, I think is one explanation, or any proof rather, believing in something without any proof of it. I think faith is something where you feel something and you may not have evidence of it, but you know it to be true. And so I think it's so important to have that faith in yourself, right? To really feel and believe in yourself being a certain way, being opened to an opportunity. So it may not be per se that you're like, hey, I want to be able to make this much money, or I want to be able to live here, or buy this, or I want to be able to have this accomplishment with this athletically. I think it's a critical part of all that is being able to really have faith and feel it that you're going to do it, or that you can help influence things for things that you can't control. So I think that's one thing. And I think things that times where I have not succeeded is when I've lost that feeling. So that's one thing. I would say another thing is persistence. You cannot underestimate the power of persistence. Raising money for the company, I basically was able, I think at one point, to raise money, a significant amount of equity capital for a business, just because I was persistent. And we should have probably given up a long time ago, because we lost a major investor. But I just kept at it, and I kept that feeling as well. I kept that faith that it was going to happen, and I kept the persistence and just stayed methodical, and it worked out. So a lot of times the reasons why it's so hard to be persistent, because it is boring, right? It is boring sometimes, in your mind, to be like, oh, I've been doing this same thing over and over again. And sometimes when something is boring, it is a signal that you shouldn't be doing it anymore, right? But as long as you're being persistent and that persistence in the Venn diagram overlaps with, you being centered emotionally with where you need to be doing, then I think you're okay. So I would say those are two key things. And then part of all that is being able to take time out, whether it's once a month or once a year, and really spend that time to center yourself, get rid of distractions. And the busier you become, the larger your family becomes, the harder that becomes. But that's just a critical thing, because you really need to spend that time to get centered. Otherwise, you can just keep going on autopilot and not have that moment to step back and be like, hey, I haven't really thought about this, and this is really important. So I like to write things down, write down my goals, write down the things that are important to me, reassess those. If I can't do it monthly, try to do it once a year. And really, it reminds you of things too that you've forgotten. So really, really important. to be able to get centered and figure out a way to do that, especially especially the busier you become, the more important it becomes.
So very true. So very true. Now, here's the final question. What is one actionable tip that can help others achieve and experience this kind of success in their life? You've talked about so much. I'd love to narrow it down to just one thing we could leave them with, that if they were to just start doing this thing each day or keep doing this thing each day, it would very much help them. And you've given a handful, but I'd love to know what the one is.
I would say, just to keep it simple, one thing you can do is to do, actually, I think it's your term, is the bookends. So start your day with your intention. Think about the things that you want to achieve, end your day reflecting upon what you did and what you could have done better. It's really simple, and you don't have to spend much time. You can spend 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes in the evening. And if you just do that, and it's helpful if you write it down, over time it creates a very powerful habit, and it makes you more aware and mindful. And that's a very simple, actionable thing you can do.
I like that. I like that. Well, thank you, sir, for spending all this time with us, for sharing so much love and life and thoughts and insights. We very much appreciate it.
You're welcome. And thank you very much for asking me to do it. And it was nice to talk about myself for half an hour.
I think it's more than that. I think when people listen in, you'll see some beautiful feedback here of their experience, and hearing about observation and philosophy and thinking deeply, and what the real human drivers are, figuring out how to bookend their day and how to have those thoughtful moments, how to just be, how to shut things off and just immerse yourself into being in the moment and being really centered and ready, and to find what's true for you and to move forward, to start looking for the miracles around us. And look for all those little things that are happening, the reminders of life and love and kind of the magic that's unfolding around us at all points in time and history. If you're looking for them, if you're trying to observe what's right with the world around you and really being observant in that factor. I loved all this. And for everyone tuning in, thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with us here. We really appreciate it. If you love what you're listening to, make sure to share. Find someone to pass this on to. Make sure to hit subscribe. And we look forward to seeing you all next episode.